Okay, now let's turn our attention to another attribute of randomness. So again, we're going to be looking at heads and tails. We're going to be flipping a fair coin. So only two outcomes, getting a head or a tail. So in this particular simulation, we tossed the coin 1,000,000 times. And we got about 500,442 heads and 499,558 tails. And that gives you exactly what you'd expect. About half, in this case 50.04% of the tosses were heads. But what's interesting about this is the difference. There were in fact 884 more heads than tails. 884 more heads than tails. So even though that ratio, the percentage of heads and tails, is both getting close to 50%, exactly as you'd expect, the magnitude of the difference between the two numbers of heads and tails is very large. So this is a simulation. I'm not going to ask you to toss a coin 1,000,000 times. So I'm using Octave for this. Octave is free and open source. This is a function that I created called the number of heads. This is what it does. It computes the number of heads when a coin is tossed n times. First I clear the screen. Then I define n to be 1,000,000. Then I initialize the number of heads. Initialize means to set it to 0. And then we enter this loop, and it goes through it 1 to n times. Remember, n is 1,000,000, so it goes through this loop 1,000,000 times. Rand creates a random number in the interval 0 to 1. Round rounds anything between a half and 1 to 1, and anything between 0 and a half to 0. In other words, half the time it returns a 0, half the time it returns a 1. When it returns a 1, we add that to the existing number of heads, and that updates the number of heads. You can't write something like this in mathematics. This is computer code. It's basically saying that heads becomes the previous number of heads plus whether we added a new head in that round or not. Then we end that, and then these last things just give us the feedback. The number of heads, the number of tails is whatever's left. The difference is that difference in the number of heads and tails, and then the ratio as it approaches 50%. So let's run this simulation a few times and see what we get. So here I am running it, so it's going to run it 1,000,000 times. And it said that the ratio is now 50.07%, so heads 50.07% of the time, really, really close to 50%. But look at that difference, 1,466 more heads than tails. So a huge difference in the number of heads and tails. Let's run it again. And it's really fast. Octave is nice that way. And it looks like here the approximate ratio is pretty much exactly 50%, and the difference is only 100. Let's run it again. And it looks like the difference now is 520. There's 520 more heads than tails. But notice that the ratio, the percentage of heads in the tosses, is really close to 50%, 50.03%. And again, 874 more heads than tails, 50.04%. A 1,046 more heads than tails, 50.05%. Looks like this time more tails. In fact, 662 more tails than heads, but still really close to 50% of the tosses resulted in a head. 49.97 is the ratio of heads to the total number of tosses. And now it looks like we've got 974 more heads than tails, really close to 50%, 50.05. You get the idea. We can continue running this application, and we can see that the ratio does become very, very close to 50%, but that absolute difference, the actual number of heads and the number of tails, they differ by huge amounts at times. Here, 520 more heads, or actually that was more tails than heads. And you can continue doing this. Again, 1,248 more, in this case, tails than heads. You get the idea. One more, and I think we can convince ourselves that even though that ratio is going to 50%, the absolute difference in terms of how many more of one of the tosses is than the other is actually pretty large, 1,250. So this, connected with the previous idea when we were looking at the sequence of tosses of heads and tails and how many runs there were and things like that, you can convince yourself that when a gambler says that something's due, that may not in fact be the case. Here there's 2,228 more tails than heads. So the idea that something's due, even though the probability does go as close as you like to 50% as you run this simulation over and over again, that absolute difference gets pretty darn big. So together, a good look at randomness and the effect of randomness on probability.